two before we actually start, but we just formally say welcome, and then we'll start in a minute or two.
Hello, good to see you as well. Long time. Last time I was here.
Yeah, good. Looks good.
There you go.
Well, we can't be many more for the COVID restrictions anyway.
No.
So, okay. Yeah, we can start, I think. Okay, let us start. Welcome to this Agrarian Change Seminar and Webinar, organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS, University of London. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS and from the Journal of Agrarian Change, and I'll be chairing the session. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Sreya Senha from University of Reading, who's online, and Enrique Castagnon, who is based at SOAS and who is here because, as said, this is both a seminar and a webinar. It's an event that takes place at SOAS, and we have an audience here in this room. Welcome to the audience in the room. And it is also broadcast live, so welcome to the webinar audience as well. The title of this seminar webinar is Agroecology and the Agrarian Question in the 21st Century, the Ties That Bind. This is also the title of a recent publication in Journal of Peasant Studies by today's speaker, Professor Haroon Akram-Lodhi. Welcome, Haroon, sitting next to me.
You don't applaud at the beginning.
No. Haroon is Professor of Economics and International Development Studies at Trent University in Peterborough, Canada. There he teaches agrarian political economy, a theme he has worked and published on for several decades now, I think. Sorry, it wasn't meant as a pun in any way. His most recent book is Handbook of Critical Agrarian Studies, which is a bit of a whopper, but absolutely interesting. So I can only recommend it. Not only Haroon's contributions, but all the contributions there are seriously interesting. Published by Edward Elka, December, I think.
December,
yeah. December 2021. Okay, so this webinar is also live streamed on our YouTube channel, and you can post comments and questions in the live chat at any time, both if you're at the YouTube channel or if you're on the webinar. You should also know that we're going to record this session. If you do not wish to be recorded, then simply don't use your audio and video if you're on the webinar. And you can find the full program of our webinar series on our website, Agrarian Questions. With that, let us start today's program. Haroon, over to you for your presentation, which may take up to a short hour, up to 50 minutes or so.
Okay.
Over to you. And I will disappear out of the screen while you're talking.
Well, thanks very much, Jens. Get your water.
Yes.
Well, first of all, of course, I want to thank Jens for inviting me to take part in this Agrarian Change Seminar. And I also want to thank Sreya and Enrico for managing the logistics. But the other thing I want to do is thank Sreya and Enrico again, because I've also given a couple of the webinars over the course of the past couple of years, and they've always managed the logistics. So I think that's a very important role in making these things work. I really can't say how much of a pleasure it is to be in person. This is the first time in 2 years that I've been able to give a seminar in person. And, you know, the cut and the thrust of the live experience is something that I don't think can be underestimated. And I really have missed it. And walking into the building this afternoon, I also realized for my sins that this year marks the 40th anniversary of my starting my undergraduate degree here. So maybe coming back and giving my first seminar is somewhat meaningful. So as Jens mentioned, I want to talk today about a paper that's already been published. And you might ask, well, why would you really want to talk about something that's already been published? And the reason is quite simple, and that's because of the pandemic. It's never been exposed to a seminar audience. So the argumentation within it has never been publicly aired. This is a paper that I started work on around this time 5 years ago, and then was finally published in the summer of 2020. And at the heart of this particular paper was a desire to confront a conundrum that has dogged my scholarly work for my entire career. So on the one hand, I was trained in agrarian Marxism by Terry Byers in this building. And as part of that training, it was argued that there could be economies of scale in farming, which suggests that over time, farming should become large scale, that large scale farming is the future of agriculture. And as a corollary of that the inverse relationship between size and productivity is a technical relation which doesn't really capture underlying social relations. On the other hand, I've worked with and studied small-scale peasant commodity production across my entire professional career, and I simply don't believe that peasants have been or should be consigned to the dustbin of history. The empirical evidence alone belies that. There's more small-scale women and men farmers today than at any other point in human history, and small-scale agriculture remains the single most important source of a livelihood for the world's peoples. And indeed, if we think back to the 1990s, one of the most salient features of the 1990s was the wholesale process of repeasantization that could be witnessed in many spaces and places around the world. Moreover, there are transnational agrarian movements that are, for all their complexity, diversity, and contradictions, arguably the largest social movement in the world, within which there are many elements that struggle against capitalism in ways that are quite unique. So this paper was and is in many ways an attempt to square the circle, so to speak, to resolve this conundrum between being an agrarian Marxist and taking the part of peasants. The paper therefore attempts to explicitly bridge the ground between scholar activists operating within a Marxist agrarian political economy perspective and those in the food sovereignty movement that advocate in favor of small-scale agroecological farming. Now, it seems to me that for small-scale farming to be consistent with agrarian Marxism, there must be one thing that is capable of doing: developing the forces of production that are a precondition of a post-capitalist future. And this is because, at its most straightforward, for Marxism, if, quote, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle, unquote, then the motor that shapes that class struggle are the relations of production, which are underpinned by the productive forces. So this paper argues that from a materialist perspective, in the current conjuncture, it is small-scale agroecological farming that offers the means by which to develop the productive forces. It is not capitalist farming. That's the argument I want to make. So in order to make this argument, the paper takes 4 steps. First, it argues that Marx believed that small-scale farming need not dissolve in order for the agrarian question to be resolved. Second, it argues that contrary to widely held views and apparent empirical evidence, contemporary capitalist agriculture is not developing the productive forces. Third, the paper argues that knowledge and energy are productive forces. And indeed, as I'll come to, in fact, it argues that they're somewhat more than just productive forces. Fourthly, the paper argues that agroecological farming is a knowledge-intensive form of production that maximizes the productivity of energy returns relative to energy investment, and that this constitutes the development of the productive forces. So together, I suggest the terms and conditions by which a contemporary agrarian question might be resolved is through an agroecological agrarian transition. And in this sense, the agrarian question and agroecology are, to me, bound together as two critical aspects of a post-capitalist future that, as I will talk about, is being politically built by the rural and food-based social movements in the present. So those are the four steps to the argument, and now really I want to go through them. So starting with the first one, on Marx and the agrarian question. Marx offered three paths that explain the transition from pre-capitalist farming to farming subsumed to capitalism. If you like, three means of resolving the agrarian question of whether, and if so how, capitalism is transforming food and agricultural production and farming systems in ways that are detrimental to the bulk of the women and men that live in the countryside. The first path is that found in volume 1 of Capital, in his account of the so-called primitive accumulation, in which predatory landlords dispossess their tenants, creating classes of rural waged labor, capitalist tenant farmers, and landlords. The second path comes from the Grundrisse and witnesses rent-paying peasant farmers exploiting rural waged labor, and this becomes the basis of capitalist farming. This path lays out the processes by which small-scale peasant farmers differentiate into distinct classes based upon whether they are net buyers or net sellers of labor power. The third path is the one that he discussed very late in his life in correspondence about the possible trajectory of Russian farming. In this reading, peasant small-scale petty commodity production could be subsumed to capitalism in so-called hybrid forms that do not subject peasant farmers to the general rate of profit. Now, this required, according to Marx, the introduction of new technologies that both developed the forces of production and sustained the position of small-scale petty commodity producers. It also required active state support for small-scale petty commodity peasant farming. The analytical point here, then, is that the place of small-scale petty commodity producing peasant farming in capitalism is a consequence not only of the general characteristics of capitalism, but also of the specific and unique structural constraints peasants face on the ground where they live. And so, as Barbara Harris White once put it, petty commodity production might be integral to varieties of capitalism. The second argument then that I make is that contrary to widely held views, contemporary capitalist agriculture is not developing the productive forces. Now, this is in many ways a contrarian, counterintuitive argument. It's contrarian because surely it's obvious that industrialized capitalist agriculture produces far more in the 2020s than at any time in the global history of agriculture. Cereal production, 61 to 2018. The trend rise is remarkable. And if you look at per capita food production around the world from 1961 onward, it systematically goes up over time. And it is true that notwithstanding the impact of the climate emergency over the course of the 21st century, there have been record harvests. So there's no doubt agricultural production is rising. But to suggest that global agriculture is developing the productive forces, it's necessary to look beyond production to productivity. And the key measure of productivity under capitalism is labor productivity. Now, labor productivity in global agriculture increased by just over 2% compound per annum between 1980 and 2015, which is undoubtedly a very impressive figure, 2% compound per annum. But if labor productivity is expressed in terms not of labor productivity itself, but in terms of the rates of growth of that productivity, and more particularly in terms of the rates of growth of constant value added per agricultural worker, then between 1994 and 2018, while the rate of growth of constant agricultural value added per worker worldwide is volatile, the trend over the entire period is near zero improvements in the rate of growth of constant agricultural value added per worker. That's the trend line in the figure. It is, to me, quite remarkable how static that trend line is. The paper also then provides estimates of rates of growth of yields per unit of land for maize, wheat, rice, and soya, which together constitute 2/3 of global calorie intake. And it does it for the period between 1964 and 2017. Two important conclusions can be drawn from looking at the rates of growth of yields per unit of land, which in the agrarian Marxist literature is thought of as a feudal measure of productivity, but which I think still bears relevance if we see static improvements in the rate of growth of constant agricultural value added per agricultural worker. So those two important conclusions are, firstly, that for the four most important crops grown in the world, the rate of growth of crop yields in kilograms per hectare has been in trend decline for decades. Across all four of them, the trend line is going down, particularly since the 1980s. And for maize and for wheat, the rate of growth of crop yields is now at a trend rate of near zero per year. So we have static growth in the rate of growth of labor productivity. And in actual fact, the rate of growth of crop yields for maize and wheat are basically static as well. It seems to me that this kind of data, which I haven't seen presented in this way elsewhere, makes it quite difficult to really conclude definitively that industrial agriculture is developing the productive forces. And actually, given the figures, the trend figures on display for more than 60 years for crop yields and for 30 years, more than 30 years for labor, given the lack of definitive improvement, one might conclude that in fact industrial capitalist agriculture is inhibiting the development of the productive forces, precisely because you're not seeing rates of growth improving over time, which one might expect. So why might industrial capitalist agriculture be inhibiting the development of the productive forces? Tony Weiss here, I think, is the person who provides the answer. I think Tony's giving the next seminar. So maybe we can ask questions about that. Tony Weiss argues that we're witnessing the accelerating deterioration of the very biophysical foundations of agriculture. And this erosion in the very biophysical foundations of agriculture is being produced by industrial capitalist agriculture. This, as Wallace and Wallace stress, results in capital in farming eroding the inherent break of environmental stochasticity. So then on to the third stage of the argument. Can small-scale petty commodity production develop the productive forces beyond that at which capitalist agriculture has achieved? That requires, firstly, a discussion of what we mean by the productive forces. And I think very commonly, we think of capital as the indicator of the productive forces in agriculture. But I make 2 points here. First, knowledge bears productive power that can materially contribute to production. And if it can materially contribute production, knowledge is a productive force. In this light, small-scale petty commodity production is in fact predicated upon knowledge. Knowledge of land, of soil, of climate, and of the agroecosystem. Knowledge is integral to the farm labor process of the small-scale petty commodity producer. Contrast this with industrial agriculture, which in fact degrades knowledge through de-skilling of the sort that was argued by Harry Braverman for industrial processes in the 1970s. Both farmers and rural wage labor are de-skilled through industrial capitalist agriculture. In effect, industrial agriculture reduces the productive power of labor while simultaneously, and quite interestingly, I think, generating alienation from the production process. Alienation, which I think is most clearly expressed in the labor process of modern abattoirs. The second point I think to make is that when we think of energy, as it's defined in physics, as the ability to do work, with work being understood as the ability to capture and expend energy, then energy is also a productive force. When an object or objects bears productive power, it represents a stock of energy that can materially contribute to production when converted into an energy flow from an object as an input to the product of production as an output. Indeed, energy is not just a productive force. It really is the basis, the foundation of all production. It is the foundation of the productive forces. And so as a productive force, it's worth considering the consequences of different farming systems for flows of energy. Now, we can broadly examine flows of energy comparing small-scale and large-scale farming using the work of the Pimentels at Cornell University. By conventional measures of both labor and land, American farms are far more productive than Mexican farms. The Pimentels have looked at energy flows for American and Mexican farms, among others. So think about maize in the US and Mexico. In terms of labor productivity, American farms far more productive. In terms of land productivity, American farms far more productive. But in terms of energy flows, the small-scale Mexican maize farm that relies on human labor is 4 times more efficient than the capitalist American farm that relies on mechanization, because it feeds energy back into securing more energy, generating large energy surpluses. We see the same in the table for sorghum. It might be suggested that the structure of social property relations under capitalism have come to fetter the development of the productive forces in farming precisely because they do not serve to minimize energy flows. And this, and I don't want to be, what's the right word? I don't want to be fundamentalist in this, but this is actually consistent with some of the thinking of Marx later in his life, who argued in volume 3 of Capital that, quote, freedom can only consist in this, that socialized man, the associative producers, govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way with the least expenditure of energy and in conditions most worthy and appropriate for the human nature. You know, studies of energy flows date from the end of Marx's life, and Marx himself was well aware of them. And he himself in this suggests that energy minimization is central to socialized man's metabolism with nature. So the notion that energy might be a productive force, I don't think is alien to an agrarian Marxist perspective. So then the fourth argument that I make is that agroecological farming is a knowledge-intensive form of production that maximizes the productivity of energy returns relative to energy investment, and that this constitutes the development of the productive forces. Now, agroecology has become a highly contested concept. Attempts to rhetorically appropriate the phrase are being used by proponents of industrial agriculture. And so one must be very careful when people say that they're promoting agroecology. What do they precisely mean by this? But for worldwide transnational agrarian movements, agroecology is firstly a science that examines and explains the functioning of agroecosystems, primarily being concerned with biological, biophysical, ecological, social, cultural, economic, and political mechanisms, functions, relationships, and design. Very holistic approach to how agroecosystems function. Agroecology is secondly a set of practices that permit farming in a more sustainable way, particularly by minimizing the use of external inputs. And then thirdly, agroecology is a movement aspiring to both ecologically sustainable and socially just farming. Agroecology requires optimizing the sustainable use of low-impact local resources while minimizing the use of high-impact farm technologies. This is done to sustain soils and micronutrients. It requires adapting farm input and output choices to reflect the ecosystem and the landscape within which the farm is embedded. The purpose of doing this is to sustain and indeed enhance crop yields so as to increase agricultural surpluses. By eliciting positive biophysical processes between plants and species, microclimates can be better maintained, biodiversity can be maximized, and long-run soil activity and hence fertility sustained by the management of organic matter. The health of the soil is at the heart of what agroecological practices seek to achieve. And this not only sustains, but it actually improves the productive potential of farming while at the same time sequestering carbon. Now, there's a need, according to its proponents, to foster agroecology because agroecology is more resilient to economic and environmental shocks. It is far more labor intensive in an age in which jobless growth is increasingly the norm. But agroecology was also historically the foundation of local communities and food systems, through which asymmetrical mechanisms of social reciprocity ensured adequate, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food for all. A right to food that was not based upon money, but was based upon the membership of a community. Asymmetrical, but still a member of a community. Finally, in terms of the discussion I've just made, agroecology increases energy returns on energy expenditures. The construction of an entire food system based on agroecology can ensure access to adequate, sufficient, safe, sustainable, and culturally appropriate food that should be available to all as a basic right of citizenship. And so agroecology directly confronts two falsehoods, which I've argued for a very long time lie at the heart of the contemporary world food system. The first falsehood, that we need capital-intensive agriculture. The second falsehood, to feed a world of 11 billion or slightly less, the population at the end of the century. I would argue contrarily that a key point about agroecology, which has been established through many scientific studies, is that it can be as productive or more productive, and as profitable or more profitable than industrial agriculture. That it is possible to feed the world agroecologically. Now, the key point that this requires then is demonstrating what is the productivity of agroecology. And I usually start with this slide from The Economist from about 8 years ago. The Rodale Institute in the UK is the oldest agricultural research center in the world. You know, field trials going back to 1850. And it's really very interesting that according to their own research, under obviously the ideal conditions of an agricultural research center, wheat produced using the best organic manures is more productive than any other form of wheat being produced. It's quite an interesting insight into productivity of land. The second point I'd want to make is a more general point. Table 2 from the paper reviews 7 studies undertaken in the 21st century. Now, these to me are worth reviewing because they have insights into the relative merits of organic and agroecological farming. I have to make the provision that organic does not equal agroecological. You can have industrial organic, as in California. However, when we compare smaller scale organic to agroecological farming, if we compare these to conventional capitalist farming techniques, that's covered in these studies, which cover a large number of data points and are very commonly referenced in the literature. Now, these 7 studies indicate that under sets of conditions where institutional, infrastructural, and economic support is available, and when attention is paid to the landscape within which the farming is carried out, the yield differences between industrial capitalist farms and smaller scale organic and agroecological farms are at worst minimal. That the environmental benefits of organic and agroecological farms are significant, and that the benefits for farm households in terms of earnings and work conditions are better on small scale organic and agroecological farms. In terms of attempting to convert conventional chemically based extractivist capitalist farms with agroecology, it seems to me there's no doubt that the leader in this research has been Jules Préti. And two particular studies I think stand out, which are displayed in table 2, Préti and Hein from 2001 and Préti from 2006. The 2001 study with Rachel Hein was really in many ways quite groundbreaking. 208 projects from 52 countries involving 9 million farmers working on 3% of all the farmland in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And what they found was that a more sustainable agriculture, which was resource conserving, which in that definition closely matches that of agroecology, produced yield increases of between 50 and 100% for rain-fed crops, and yield increases of between 5 and 10% for irrigated crops. Yield increases were typically bigger for households with smaller holdings of land and greater food insecurity, indicating that the benefits flowed to poorer farmers. They disproportionately benefited from shifts to more resource conserving agroecological methods. In 2006, Préti produced a second study that explicitly sought to construct a comparative database of developing country projects involving farms transitioning from conventional chemically based extractivist farming to agroecological farming. He examined 8 different categories of FAO farming systems across 57 countries in order to evaluate the impact of yields resulting from such a transition. In all, 286 projects were included involving 12.6 million farmers operating 37 million hectares, 3% of the cultivated area in developing countries. And the results of that are particularly laid out in table number 3. In all but 3 of the projects that he examined, project yields increased after a shift to agroecology. In those 3 projects where this did not take place, all were rice projects. 1/2 of all the projects reported yield increases of between 18 and 100%, and 1/4 of the projects indicated yield increases of more than 100%, demonstrating that after the shift, yields more than doubled. And the shift to agroecology was also shown to have significant positive externalities across both the economy and the ecology. Finally, the paper notes a more recent study, the results of the West Africa Productivity Program's scaling up of the system of rice intensification in West Africa project. This involved in West Africa 50,000 small-scale farms and 750,000 people. Yields for farmers using the SRI method, which I'm well aware has been critiqued very well by Marcus Taylor in the Journal of Agrarian Change, but yields for the use of this method increased overall by 56% for irrigated rice and 86% for lowland rain-fed rice in West Africa. Irrigated rice was 2.4 times more productive under SRI methods when compared to conventional methods. Lowland rice was 2.2 times more productive. And average incomes for those farmers that were investigated using SRI methods in West Africa were 41% higher than those using conventional practices. Now, I grant that labor productivity is the key motor of capitalism, but nonetheless, I think that one minimal conclusion that is reasonable is that agroecology can generate near comparable yields to the historically unparalleled yields of contemporary capitalist agriculture. I think that's a reasonable thing to say. As Vandana Shiva has put it, it's not industrial agriculture that feeds the world, it's the earth, the pollinators, and the small-scale petty commodity producing farmers, the ones who are particularly threatened by industrial agriculture and increasingly marginalized in ways that foster the emergence of zoonotic pathogens like COVID-19, as I've written about elsewhere. Now, there's one objection to this analysis that I would always expect from agrarian political economists, and that is this: that agroecological petty commodity producers are not a homogeneous social group. There are rather differential interests which can emerge within petty commodity producing peasantries as they are or are not incorporated into capitalism as it develops. At the same time, the localized small-scale farming model that is so central to agroecology, agrarian political economists might argue, cannot be abstracted from capitalist social relations, which are defined by relations of exploitation between classes of labor and classes of capital. Now, this, for me, however, is the reason why agroecologists and their allies must build power within the fissures of the existing capitalist social property relations in order to transform food systems in favor of peasants and other small-scale farmers, fishers, food system workers, and underserved urban communities of exploited workers. I would suggest that this is not the same, but is consistent with the political strategy advocated by Frederick Engels in the peasant question in France and Germany. So it seems to me that agroecology might well be consistent with Marx and Engels' views on the progressive possibilities of politicized small-scale petty commodity producers shaping an emerging post-capitalist future within actually existing capitalism. The ties that bind the agrarian question and agroecology is that they are components of a post-capitalist future that is being built in the present by elements of the global movement for food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is based on the rights of peoples and countries to define their own agricultural and food policy. It reflects that farmers should have the right to produce food, but also receive a price for it that reflects their actual cost of production and not the world market prices which most of them currently face. It also argues that eaters should be adequately informed about from whom their food comes, as well as what is in what they are eating, so that they can better decide what it is that they're consuming. Food sovereigntists also argue that the rights of peoples and countries should be facilitated so that they can decide how and by whom food is produced and consumed. This would involve, however, the protection of both farmers and eaters from international food dumping, which arises from direct and indirect export subsidies, and which so importantly remove the livelihoods of so many small-scale farmers. And so there's a need to reestablish protection for national agricultures from low-priced imports, while phasing out government measures that promote unsustainable agriculture, such as the monopoly of subsidies in the United States and in the European Union for the centralization and consolidation of large-scale agriculture, rather than support for smaller-scale farming. Food sovereignty is the movement for a new food system in a post-capitalist future. So that's the argument in the paper. If the subject of this has interested you as students, you can find out more about it in my podcast, Peasants, Food, and Agrarian Change. Thanks very much. I look forward to questions both from the audience here and the audience that's watching. But imagine questions in person. Wow, what a long time that's been. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Haroon. Let's just see if we can stop screen sharing here. And if we can get all people up here. Yes.
It stopped, Jens.
Good, good. So we now have everyone on the screen. Thanks, Haroon, for this really sophisticated, but also very thought-provoking and politically provoking presentation. And I do hope it will generate a few comments and questions. So we now move on to the phase of the seminar, where we take questions and answers and comments from the audience, and we'll see if we can manage to to deal with both the audience here and online and juggle questions. But before we start with that, and of course the audience online, if they can raise their hand, their electronic hand, if they want to ask questions or comments, then that would be great. And Shreya and Enrique will check the chats and contribute through that, we hope. But to kick it off, let me just have a few comments and questions to you. That can maybe so get us all thinking even further. So first, some very interesting points, which sort of, as far as I can see, there are a number of aspects of them. There's a theoretical argument for what is productive forces and development of productive forces. There's an empirical argument of what is actually going on the ground, and what can increase productivity or maintain productivity, feed the people, the population.
Sure.
And there is a political argument that relates to emerging post-capitalist futures and what is happening on the ground in that sense. Now, I would love to ask questions to all of them, but I will just sort of pick out two elements there for now. The one is about the agroecology feeding the world. Not sort of that's an obvious question, but within that, the argument that agroecology can be very productive. Now, productivity here is, as you pointed out, it's both yield, it's also labor productivity. Yes. Now, there is an argument in the literature, for example, around SRI rice, that it does indeed increase productivity, yield. Yeah. And that's great, but it also involves a good deal more labor. Yeah. So labor productivity falls. And the reason why small farmers can make a profit from it is that this simply means using more household labor, working harder, which of course has a gendered aspect too, that women tend to work harder in order to achieve that. So is it, is the suggestion then that what we need is peasant households to self-exploit more in order for agroecology to work? Now, that to me is a serious issue. It's not a slogan. It is, what are we talking about when we're talking about agroecology? Now, that, or is it that agroecology involves much higher food prices, with what that means of changes to society? Right. What do we mean when we say this can work? Sure. It seems too quick to say. But I understand it's important to say, is it possible? But there are some quite important implications, even if this is possible. So that is one question. And the other one is the existence of emerging post-capitalist futures. Now, when I look at agriculture, I see a stronger and stronger agro-industrial complex. I see bigger and bigger monopolization. I see petty commodity producers that are becoming more and more differentiated, moving halfway out of agriculture. Now, yes, there are also other tendencies, but isn't it sort of, aren't you very optimistic when you choose to focus on agroecology as the emerging futures, and thereby ignoring that so it seems what is even more emergent is a more dominant capitalist agricultural path. So these are sort of two. I mean, and there are many other issues.
There's three questions.
There.
There's three questions there. The food price question is separate from the self-exploitation. So, three very good questions. Should peasants self-exploit more? Obviously, okay. I would say the answer, of course, is no. It is true that agroecology is far more labor intensive. And it is also true that, that there's more labor in the fields in many instances. Now, having said that, there are studies of SRI use in some parts of South Asia, which actually demonstrates that labor productivity goes up, even as the employment of labor goes up, because the yield increase is so much greater. So it's not, we can conceive of situations where labor productivity goes up and the yield increase goes up, if it's quite a lot. So that's a limited amount of evidence, and I'm prepared to concede that, absolutely. And what I would say is, this is something that needs to be looked at far more carefully and far more systematically. And this is something which I think, for the most part, those that promote agroecology haven't looked into labor productivity issues. Absolutely not. But also, agrarian political economists haven't really looked into labor productivity issues on agroecological farms. Okay, so I take your point, and it's an inadequate answer, but I'm saying this is what we need to better understand. Okay, we definitely need to better understand this, because obviously I'm not in favor of greater self-exploitation. Yeah. So, but just to reiterate what I said, yes, there are situations where we've seen empirical studies where labor productivity has declined, but there are also counterexamples. So this, to me, is quite an unsettled question. It does require a lot more work. The second question is higher food prices that come about through this, through a shift to more agroecological farming. That's a much broader question, because we live in a food system which is driven by the production of low-priced food, so that low-waged labor can be fed. Yeah, and that's an incredibly perverse food system. Yeah, what we should be thinking about is how we generate a food system which generates a viable, decent livelihood for farmers. Yeah, one where possibilities of accumulation are not an impossibility. Yeah, but to do that, food prices have to be much higher. At the same time, we shouldn't expect food prices to necessarily be cheap. Why would we expect, which we do, that food prices would only be 10% of our spending, of our disposable spending? You know, historically, it's a huge anomaly that food is so cheap. Yeah, and what that does is it transfers, you know, income out of people's pockets. But who benefits from those higher food prices? It's precisely the agro-industrial complex, the increasing monopolization that you talked about for the third question. They're the ones that principally benefit from these higher food prices. We don't. We benefit from a global crisis of malnutrition, with 7 out of 10 people in the world either being obese or hungry. Yeah, I mean, better, more nutritious food has to be more expensive. We shouldn't see that as a problem. What it does point to is the fact that we're used to low-wage societies. That's a function of the wider capitalist economy. In terms of the post-capitalist future, as you see increasing monopolization of the agro-industrial food complex and differentiation of peasant commodity producers, I totally agree. In another talk, I've got a very nice slide which lays out the global value chain. You know, and the reality is that the 4 biggest supermarkets in the global value chain capture 1/4 of all the value in the global food system. Now you think, how can 4 companies capture, you know, 1/4 of $8 trillion? That's because they structure the entire operation of the system. And in some ways, it's not surprising if we think about it. 1 out of every $2 spent on food in the United States is spent at Walmart. No wonder they're capturing so much value out of the food system. But Walmart and other supermarkets are predicated, they say they're rolling the prices back, but they're still getting gross margins of 20% on processed food and 40% on fresh food. 40% gross margins, pretty healthy margin. You know, they're in this business not to help people, but to generate profits for short-term for short-term financial markets. So the agri-food complex itself has to be transformed. Yeah, and agroecology is that movement for an alternative food system. Now, am I optimistic about that? Well, I would like to be. Well, what I said to someone who asked a question of me a couple of days ago about, you know, where are the social movements? And I thought back, you know, to the turn of the last decade when you had, you know, widespread student protests in Chile and Quebec, where you had Occupy in the United States, you had, you know, large-scale social movements in Barcelona, you know. There was an indigenous social movements in Canada were all over the place 10 years ago. There was something going on there. And at the time, I really knew it. If these could be brought together, there would be the cusp of some kind of anti-systemic movement. But those emerged out of nowhere. And so part of me came to the realization that perhaps the movements for that future, they could emerge much more quickly than we realize. Just as social media, technology companies transformed capitalism much more quickly than we thought about. In that sense, maybe I am optimistic, but I also have to be optimistic because climate breakdown is going to underpin a collapse in agriculture. And if nothing's done 20 years from now, well, the game will be very different.
Thanks for those answers, informative and also political, which is how it should be. Now we have 5 people ready to ask questions online. I think we have a number of comments, questions in the chat as well. I think let's first take 2 of the questions online and then go to the chat and then return to 2 more of the question of the people wanting to ask questions. 6 now online, but the first one to put his hand up was Arturo Esquero. Arturo, over to you.
Oh, hi, Haroon. Good to see you, and thank you for such a powerful and illuminating presentation. So in the talk and in the paper, you talk about industrial capitalist agriculture and then sometimes extractive capitalist agriculture, and kind of seem to use them interchangeably. And, you know, as I'm sure you know, in Latin America, there's a big literature on extractivism, which traditionally kind of been used to describe mining and hydrocarbons, but more recently, kind of agriculture, large-scale monocrop, particularly soy, has been kind of included under that umbrella. So I was just curious to see what your, see if you see it as these as just synonymous, agrarian extractivism and industrial agriculture, if there's some conceptual utility in distinguishing them. I think you touched on a lot of those points about the erosion of the biophysical space, descaling of labor, extraction of the energy in terms of input-output ratios, but perhaps even politically as well, in terms of to kind of agglutinate a lot of these social movements in other extractive sectors for these kind of some of these systematic anti-systematic changes that you were talking about. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Arturo, for that.
Should we just take one more question
ahead,
to bunch them a bit, to give everyone a chance and to give you a chance to answer more than one at a time. So Carla Grass is the next one.
Yes, thank you for such a stimulating talk. I had two questions or comment. One is more theoretical, just to say, and cognitive capitalism theories have discussed the role of knowledge as a productive force, and so and many critical approaches to these theories point to how they leave aside, or they are not so clear about how this recognition of knowledge redefines or not the concept of value and value creation. Is there any point in which your argument discusses with these frameworks on cognitive capitalism? And the other is, rather than a question, a comment, because for example, in Argentina, agribusiness coalitions have argued and legitimized the superiority of industrial agriculture or the agronegocio, leaning precisely on the role of knowledge, as a democratic asset, because the argument was that everyone can learn or can have knowledge about how to do things, and that's not, and if you don't have it, in any case, you can achieve it. While accessing to land, it is a barrier to develop agriculture. And amazingly, for example, many of large-scale firms have defined here in Argentina themselves as landless. So that would be my question and comment.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Now, I've had a request from my editor colleague, Carlos Oya, to jump the queue because he's off to do, I guess, to pick up his kids. So
I'll make sure to answer after he's left.
Yeah, you can do that. But Carlos, yes, please jump in now.
He's in the car.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, it's just I'm in the car, so this is a new experience for me, driving, cooking, and listening to Haroon. So I may have missed some of the arguments. I mean, some of the elements of the argument. So forgive me if I got anything wrong. But this was, I think, really extremely stimulating presentation, and right at the big questions, which that's something I really appreciate. Makes it much more interesting. But let me just be, the usual devil and point out a couple, 3 cracks that I see, 3 tensions in the claims that Haroon made. I mean, the first one, and they all require some empirical additional work, I suppose, or just some clarification from Haroon. The first one is the claim that the data from the last 30, 40, 50 years on aggregate productivity trends would suggest that industrial agriculture is failing to contribute to productive forces. I think there's a bit of a fallacy there in the sense that if those are aggregate global statistics, then that would include an awful lot of your small scale farmers, since a large proportion of those trends in productivity are accounted for by productivity trends in small scale agricultural sector, especially in low income countries and regions where productivity is, as we know, extremely low, especially labor productivity, and it hasn't been doing very well in the last 4 decades at least, and for all sorts of reasons. So that's the first thing. So you can't really use global production statistics and global productivity statistics, especially the ones that use as the denominator of the agricultural worker, which is also very badly measured for the small scale sector, to say that industrial agriculture is not contributing to the productive sources. One would have to look at the last 200 years. You would have to look at the actual industrial agriculture in the United States and other rich capitalist countries and so on. So that's the first thing. I mean, that's I think that weakens part of that claim. The second thing is I think partly related to what Carla said, is bringing knowledge into the picture. And my view is also that knowledge is produced constantly, has been produced constantly in global agriculture, and indeed industrial agriculture can be considered as quite knowledge intensive, especially if you look at industrial agriculture in greenhouse farming, horticultural production, and so on. Is the amount of knowledge and investment in technology, etc., that's been going on for the last 30 years or so has been phenomenal. So I think there's a need to distinguish between different kinds of knowledge, codified, tacit knowledge, doing different things for the production process. But we can't really make the argument that some kinds of farmers are more knowledge intensive than others. But at least that has to be more strongly proven empirically. And the third final point is just an empirical one. We do know from the recent statistics that actually the size of farms is decreasing on a global scale. So actually, we do have more and more small-scale farms, and in some contexts, really micro, the very, very small-scale farms. Yet the question is, what proportion of these really practice agroecology as you define it on a global scale? Yeah. And the follow-up question to that is, when petty commodity producers are given the chance of moving, up into the ladder of conventional agriculture with more inputs, more energy use, etc., they do it. At least they do it in some context. How would that change your argument? I mean, what does it take to bring the mass of petty commodity producers on a global scale to become your agroecological heroes? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. And that ended up being quite a few questions covering a good deal of ground, but over to you.
Okay, Arturo, I'm going to save my answer to you because something that Carlos said made me rethink it on the spot. So I'm going to save that. So I'll go on to Carla. I don't really engage with these theories of cognitive capitalism. Okay. What I simply want to do here is think about ways in which knowledge is deployed, because far too often I think we take it for granted. And so it's not so much about value creation for me. It's more simply about the idea that it bears power on production. And so that does have an effect on value creation, but I'm not going to go as far as talking about cognitive capitalism, because quite honestly, that's way outside my remit in terms of what I try and do. Yeah, I'm just trying to really highlight the ways that very often we don't take sufficient account of what people know and the extent to which people, in rural areas do have an understanding of their ecosystem, which means that it doesn't necessarily require the transformation of that ecosystem into a one-size-fits-all industrial agricultural model. Okay. Your second question about industrial agriculture using knowledge does tie in to Carlos's second question, that there's a lot of knowledge produced in industrial agriculture. I don't want to really deny that that's the case, because obviously all you've got to do is think about the research into transgenic organisms and the research into gene editing and the implications of that to know that there's huge amounts of investment in new knowledge in industrial agriculture. I think my point is somewhat different, and that is that for rural workers in industrial agricultural systems, the vast bulk of these workers are de-skilled. And that, they're expected not to use their knowledge. They're expected to essentially do what they are told, yeah? Because they're not expected to know how things might be done better. So it seems to me that for rural workers, there's a degradation of knowledge, because for those workers, industrial agriculture is much more akin to the same kinds of things that Braverman talked about in assembly lines. Okay, so I'm not saying that there's not knowledge created. Yeah, the three of us know that that technologies are not socially neutral. In a capitalist social system, you would expect technologies to be developed which generate greater surplus for the capitalist social system. Yeah. So that's not a surprise. The issue is, to me, about knowledge of rural workers. And it seems to me that small-scale farmers very often use far more of the knowledge than rural workers. Okay. In terms of the data, I think it's a very good point, Carlos, that you make, that small scale farming is included in those global estimates. Very, very good point indeed, right? And so there's an aggregation of capitalist in agriculture and small scale farming. But to go on to your third point about what percentage of small scale farmers, practice agroecology, it's very small. Most small scale petty commodity producers practice more extractivist agricultural methods. And because that share is so small, I'm not sure it's necessarily a fallacy to say that the trend productivity rate of labor and of land is really quite remarkably disappointing, because they are using capitalist methods in what they're doing. All you've got to do is think of the use, the extent to which petty commodity producers see, and I'll come back to the third question in a minute, their usage of things like chemical fertilizers if given the option, or pesticides if given the option. They're integrated into that system. I do think, however, in that question about fallacy, Carlos, you point to a very good, you make an implicit point, which is very good, about the distinction between capitalist agriculture versus industrial agriculture. Yeah, because for Arturo's point, I was going to say that I first became aware of the idea of extractivism really in a chapter that was in a book that Cristobal Kay and myself and June Boras edited back in the last decade. Miguel Tubel was the first person in that particular book who spoke to agriculture as extractivist. And since then, I've thought an awful lot about it. And if you do think about what industrial agricultural methods require, industrial agricultural methods are about mining nutrients from the soil. Yeah, it's nothing more than that. It is possible to envisage capitalist agricultural methods which do not do that in the same way. Because certainly in California, you've got these very large scale capitalist organic farms, which may denude water, but don't necessarily denude soils of other micronutrients to the extent that more industrial extractivist methods do. So I think that I need to think a bit more, because my response to Arturo would have been industrial agriculture, extractivist agriculture, these are basically the same. But I think maybe I need to think that through a bit more. In terms then of the final point, that when petty commodity producers are given the chance to use industrial techniques, they do it. This is absolutely right. On a global scale, the numbers of people, the numbers of farms that practice agroecological farming is very, very small. But you have to also be cognizant of the fact that farmers have been told now for 70 years that industrial agricultural methods are the way to get the most out of your land. That's how you generate your surpluses, and that's how you generate your incomes. I think the agrarian crisis in India certainly demonstrates the extent to which many petty commodity producers have come to realize that the fallacy of that argument as they get ensnared in debt traps. And those debt traps also are found in other parts of the world as well. And what many of those farmers don't realize, don't know, is that the farming techniques that they've lost were farming techniques that were actually far more sustainable. I was very struck when I was doing the field work that I'm using for my next book in Malawi, Uganda, and Tanzania, the extent to which many petty commodity producers were using much more climate-friendly production methods, to the degree to which, they hadn't forsworn fertilizers, but if they had a bit of spare cash, going to fertilizer was not their first choice, because they realized that to deal with the climate change that they're facing, fertilizer isn't the issue. There's other things that really need to be done. And I particularly saw that in Malawi. So, you know, as Carlos says, it is true that petty commodity producers, given the chance, they opt for the fertilizers, they opt for the pesticides. But many of them, you know, when they come up against the hard realities of what that entails, I think come to regret that particular decision. These are tough questions, but that's okay.
That's how it should be.
That's how it should
Thanks.
be.
Yes, yes, yes.
That's how it
So the
should be.
question then is that regret, how to turn that into something more than just a regret. But
Yeah.
that is now to return to the questions. There are some very good comments and questions in the chat, but before going to them, I think we jumped you, Tanya, to give space for Carlos. So let us return to you first for your question.
Okay, thank you. So thanks, Haroon. This was fascinating. And you know, I've been working, as you know, recently or for the last decade in plantations. And I would say that would be one sector in which technologies have been largely static for at least 100 years. You know, the way that rubber, sugar, oil palm, sugar, tea are produced is very similar to the way they were in colonial times, or in some cases actually in slave times. So I think, you know, you could make the argument for the staticness of the agricultural technology in the plantation sector. I'm not sure about the other food sectors and so on, because I don't know that literature. But for me, what's really striking is that nevertheless, plantations perform a sort of drama or theatre of productivity. They somehow are able to conjure the idea that by virtue of their massive scale and perhaps their big belching mills, that they are kind of icons of productivity and modernity. And I think they do this so successfully that the question of their actual productivity per hectare is hardly ever asked. It's assumed that they must be productive because look at these whopping, you know, industrial configurations. So, you know, if you scratch below the surface, as we've been doing in our work recently, you find out, first of all, that they're massively subsidized by virtually free land and free labor, and often virtually free capital. So they don't operate under the same capitalist constraints that most smallholders do, you know, where they pay real money for land and labor and to borrow. You know, they're actually in a fully capitalist economy where you pay for your cost of production, but plantations largely don't, right? They are subsidized on all these fronts. So, you know, thinking about, you know, I would argue that that's a case where the large scale configuration is sort of an emperor with no clothes, and yet it rules and it proliferates and it expands. And so I'm wondering, sort of as a political strategy, like what you've been showing us today is to really emphasize the potential and the productivity of the small scale. But I think we need to do an equal amount of work to demonstrate the nakedness of the plantation and its equivalents, right? To show how fantastically inefficient they actually are in relation to land, labor, and often capital as well, in order to somehow short circuit what I now increasingly think of as a kind of a racialized optic, in which, you know, what I call, you know, the natives on the spot, whoever they are, you know, the farmers of Africa, Asia, Latin America, are often through a sort of a racialized lens, assumed to be hopeless, unproductive, you know, lazy natives, incompetent, whereas the corporation, the plantation, the large farm, you know, coded white, is the one from you know, where you expect productivity and modernity to emerge. So I think there's some work we have to do, in addition to the work that you're doing, to kind of really undermine the self-evidence of the productivity of the large scale. So that's, I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but that's kind of what I can offer.
Well, very, very interesting though. But before I hand back to Haroon, maybe this is the time to go to the chat and hear some of the questions from there. Enrique, are you able to do that? Will you come up here and do it? Okay, so Shreya, will you start?
Yeah, sure. I can start. There's a lot on the chat actually. So we have Harshita who is saying that basically the green revolution has de-skilled a sizable proportion of the petty commodity producers in the global south who also depend on synthetic fertilizers, etc. So perhaps smallholders and large holders can be seen to be practicing two different versions of industrial agriculture, and there may be a massive skilling, maybe the requirement for a massive reskilling effort. Also, energy productivity may not be the most crucial productive force if the world succeeds in moving towards renewable energy. Mariana has asked, I would like to ask how to navigate the contradictions in the transition processes towards agroecological forms of production. So, specifically with reference to financial support, renting land, technological packages. She writes that even the MST entered the stock market last year to help finance their production. So, what about this? I think there are a couple of other comments. Should I read all of them, Jens, or should I stop here? I think.
So I think Enrique is ready to jump in now.
Okay,
So
yeah.
let's him do that. Thanks. So I'll just move because we have the microphone here. So
Musical chairs.
yes.
Right. So just adding to what Shreya was saying, there are other questions, shorter ones. One is from Elena. She asked if you can reflect a little bit on the situation of the urban poor. So where do they fit into your argument? And Caroline, she asks, why would you use the rate of growth of yields instead of the actual yields increases over time? Okay.
So that was a good number of comments and questions. I hope you got most of them. So would you care to give your responses?
Sure. First to Tanya. Just so that everyone knows, Tanya's new book on plantations has recently been published. Oh, claps here. There we go. Claps there. I haven't read it yet, but I'm very eager to read it. I love this phrase, icons of modernity. That's a really, I mean, that's quite the phrase. I do think that when it comes to plantations, I take Tanya's points. I would take not an issue with one of them, because she says we need to understand much better the productivity of plantations. I think that the way in which plantations, contemporary plantations, fit into agri-food commodity chains now is that they're able to provide large bulk supplies of commodities for traders who do not want to aggregate small amounts. And so for the traders, there is a cost saving involved that they do not have to do this process of aggregation. And so the bulk commodity supply angle is part of the reason why we've seen, I think, in this proliferation of plantations in certain parts of the world. The other point I would say about the static technology, Tanya, is that in some of the plantation crops like banana and palm, there has been significant genetic modification, which is a technological change, no matter whether you think it's the right one or the wrong one. So there has been some in terms of alterations to the genome of the crop in order to bring together greater harmonization, precisely so that it can go into the agri-food commodity chain as a bulk commodity. But that phrase, icons of modernity, that's quite a phrase. First question from Shreya on the Green Revolution and de-skilling. I mean, this is absolutely correct that the Green Revolution did lead, in my view, to massive de-skilling amongst petty commodity producers, not just in South Asia, but in many parts of the world. And it is interesting, this comment, could there not be two different versions of industrial agriculture, small versus large? And it is true that they're different in terms of scale and there's differences in terms of consequences. But very often the kinds of production techniques that are taught to small scale farmers replicate those of the large scale farmers. So they're expected to adopt labor processes which mirror on a much smaller scale that of the much larger scale farmers. In terms of the Green Revolution, de-skilling, and then thinking around reskilling, In terms of reskilling, the point that I'd make really here is the work that Eric Holt Jimenez has done in the 2000s on farmer-to-farmer movements across Latin America, and also some work on farmer-to-farmer movements in sub-Saharan Africa, in which farmers themselves extend their knowledge of what they do in their agroecosystem to other farmers. And in some parts of Latin America, the use of farmer-to-farmer networks as a means of reskilling has been extremely important, to the extent that the Canadian National Farmers Union, which is the Canadian element within La Via Campesina, also supports very strongly farmer-to-farmer movements as a way of spreading knowledge around alternative production methods and methodologies. For that question, just to be clear, when I was talking about energy, I was not talking about hydrocarbons. I was talking about energy as it is understood in physics as the capacity to do work. The way in which physicists understand energy is a very different conception than the way it's used in everyday language. And I have to say, it takes a while to get your head around it, because I'm not a physicist and my physics was lousy more than 40 years ago, if it was 40 years coming here. In terms of support for transitions, obviously, the promotion of a transition to a different kind of food system would require very significant state support, which means that sooner or later, politicized rural movements in alliance with urban movements does have to address the issue of the state. It certainly has been the case that there are very solid examples of situations in which rural social movements both work with and against the state, to use a phrase that a late friend of mine, Martin Dornbus, I think was the person who formulated it, in the sense that they would support people in the state who are doing things that are beneficial for them, but work against the state in areas where they're doing things that are antithetical to them. And you see that kind of schizophrenia in many states, including in the United States, in terms of the way in which the Department of Agriculture regulates farming. State support is very important. I think a starting point of state support is a wholesale rethinking of subsidy systems where they exist, number one, and where subsidy systems have been dismantled, a rethinking of subsidy systems to support smaller scale livelihoods. Yeah, I think that's the basis of any kind of support for some kind of transition. Now, the question of the urban poor. Now, this is a very important question because it's increasingly the case that the great Dutch political economist Jan Bremen referred to as footloose labor, a phrase which is very much confined to agrarian political economy, I think. Footloose labor is increasingly found all around the world, but it's, to use the Chinese phrase, it's footloose labor that floats between the urban and the rural. And many of the urban poor are people who partially construct their lives in the city and partially construct their lives in the countryside and try and do something in that kind of way because of the constrained circumstances in which they face their lives. I think the biggest issue in terms of thinking about an agroecological transition for the urban poor is the issue of rising food prices. But this goes back to an older argument that I've made, which is that there has to be, it seems to me, at some point, an element of decommodification of food. That a meaningful right to food is not something which should be mediated through money. And I have received questions, well, how can you decommodify food, right? I mean, what are you going to do about that? How is that possible? And the answer that I thought about for that is that, there's many parts in the world where, significant aspects of healthcare are effectively decommodified. There's many parts of the world in which significant aspects of education are significantly decommodified. those social provisioning systems were previously commodified and became decommodified. So the idea that, decommodification is something which one can't really talk about is something which really reflects, I think, this incredibly strong common sense that we've had since the mid-1980s, that things are the way they are and they have always been that way, and therefore, how are we ever going to change them? But the reality is people who are older know that things are not always, they have not always been that way. They have been different, and they could be different again. And there are, countries, nations, states around the world that have sought to do things like decommodify parts of their health system in the contemporary period, or decommodify parts of their education system in the contemporary period. So I think one has to realize that the things that we think of sometimes as immutable are possibly not as immutable. The example that I like to give on this actually is the supermarket. Well, what are we, how can we get rid of supermarkets? How can we conceive of that world? I can conceive of that world because in the province in Canada where I live, we have this thing called the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. And what this is, it's a state-run liquor distribution outlet. So everyone has to buy from the state. Now, these stores are quite remarkable. The Liquor Control Board of Ontario is the biggest purchaser of alcohol in the world. The result of this is that, alcohol capital competes to get shelf space in these stores, and the Liquor Control Board is able to drive down prices with the companies, because they're competing over shelf space. Now, those price changes, driving down those prices are not necessarily transferred onto the consumer, because the Liquor Control Board also works on the principle of a minimum price, right? That there should be a minimum price for something which can be medically harmful. One of my former colleagues once did a very simple analysis of the surpluses that the Liquor Control Board transfer to the provincial government versus the taxes it would pay if it was a private company. And the difference was that the private taxes would be less than 10% of the surpluses that were transferred to the provincial treasury, because all of the surpluses were being transferred to pay for healthcare, to pay for education. So I can actually, and in where I live, many people think that the state provision of alcohol is terrible, get rid of it. But I can think of alternative food distribution systems which are controlled by the state in ways that work through markets, which are very, very efficient in neoclassical terms, and which do deliver benefits to people through transfers to people. So, I sometimes think we need to think outside the box in terms of these things. Okay, the question on the rate of growth of yields rather than yields. Again, I think the reason I did that was out of the box thinking. Sometimes when you see data that's self-evident, you have to think creatively about, well, what is that really saying to us? Yeah, and it says to me that we're interested in increases in productivity. But is it increases in what's in the productivity per unit of land, or is it a trend increase in the rate of growth of that productivity? Yeah, so that you've got a slight upward, and it could be a slight upward line from a very low base, but it's going up. I think capitalist productivity is about that, a trend increase in the rate of growth of that productivity. So that's why I opted for that.
Okay, thanks. Now we have now 3 questions remaining in the chat, and we will return to them. Christopher K has also just raised his hand. I will now go through a number of the people with the hands up online. So first Hashim, then Steve. Hashim. You are still mute, Hashim.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So it's going to be a problem of raising a hand rather early on and getting a chance later. But I think it's still a valid sort of comment to make. I think one of the questions when this question of price sort of keeps coming up, and I think the question, and Haroon's kind of talked about a little bit, is where does most of the cost we pay for food go? I remember, and then in my fieldwork, farmers were being paid like ₹5 for potatoes, while when I was buying them from market an hour away, they were being sold for ₹50. So there's a 10 times difference in the price. And that money, and these farmers were protesting, they were destroying their crops. They were effectively becoming sort of losing their land or potentially losing their land. And that kind of question of where the cost of food goes, I think is very essential when we start talking about this question of price. And often when food prices rise, they do so without an increase in accumulation by rural producers.
Yes.
And there can conceivably be a situation in which food prices remain the same through a restructuring of agrarian markets and food systems. And I think this is quite crucially a point that I think often becomes lost in this discussion. The other thing maybe to talk about is actually flipping it around. And one of the interesting debates that sort of came up when I was part of this process in the Committee of sort of World Food Security a couple of years ago around sort of food systems guidelines is this idea of the true cost of industrial food. And industrialized food is effectively cheap because of subsidies, sort of hidden ecological costs, and the self-exploitation of peasants, farmers, and agricultural workers. And this is on top of the fact that industrialized agriculture, as Haroon has sort of been pointing out, has been developed over centuries of colonialism, imperialism, and agribusiness domination. So if we are to develop agroecology as a serious alternative, then it would require the restructuring of markets, food systems, as well as the place of labor in the global economy. Yeah. And I just wanted to maybe say, it might seem like a difficult task, but I guess, part of our task is to sort of dream up new alternatives, especially in a context where movements are talking about them. And very much sort of ideas like food sovereignty, peasant agroecology are coming from movements and not academics. So yeah, that's it from my side.
Thanks, Hashim. We're still getting more questions and more comments, though we're getting less and less time, but we will manage to have them all heard, I'm sure. Steve.
Thank you very much, Haroon. I think my comments support what you're saying, and they concern small-scale mechanization. And at least my experience of working in Asia, many of the smaller farms there have increased their productivity across the board because they are using smaller scale machinery. And that's where I would think that you might look more into that and separate out small-scale machinery from a notion of industrialized agriculture, because some people think industrialized agriculture means mechanization. Yeah. And what your argument is that you can have smaller scale, but it's mechanized. Mm. Okay, that's it.
Great, thanks, much appreciated. Next one is Christopher K.
Sorry, I couldn't find the little symbol to raise the yellow hand.
Fine. We saw you.
But Haroon, I much enjoyed your presentation. I recall our joint article on the Agrarian question, which we published many years ago in General Peasant Studies. And we expanded the 3 agrarian questions that are commonly known to 7. And the 7th, the latest one, the 7th was the ecological one. Yeah. And in some ways we put it there because we didn't know very much what to say about it, except that it needs further investigation and that it's very important for capital accumulation and so on and so forth. So I very much welcome that you yourself are starting to research this agrarian question, the agroecological agrarian question. Now, my question is a very broad one and was already partly answered in some of your answers to some questions, is how do we go about to transform the system, the agrarian system, into an agroecological system? And of course, it's utopian in a certain way, and it's something where one has to look in the long term. It's a long-term vision that one has for the future. But certainly with climate change and so on, the agroecological issues coming more and more to the fore. But how would you go about it in convincing the states, the social movements, the voters and so on, to begin this transition? And that's where you already mentioned in some of the answers indirectly that, for example, you mentioned food prices would have to rise. That would one issue. Another one that you mentioned is to need much more support from the state for this transition, especially also restructuring the subsidy system, which of course is all right. And but one key issue in my view is also that you would have to change the whole property relationships to land, in the sense that these large, if your argument is correct, that agroecological farming is more sustainable and more viable in small-scale farms and largely peasant farms, then of course, in some ways you're ruling out, in some ways, that these big agro conglomerates are unable in some ways to make this transition. And that's of course another question, is that the case or not? But assuming that your argument is correct, in order to make a convincing argument, as Carlos and others mentioned, we need much more empirical analysis to justify it. And one of the key thorny political issues is that you would have to redistribute land on a massive scale. In the sense, these huge farms, mega farms, particularly in America, for example, 10,000 hectares, 5,000 hectares, these plantation farms in Asia and so on, even the farms in the United States and so on, you would have to create a sort of redistributivist agrarian reform. And there the question arises, well, is this agricultural labor and all the past peasants, have they still the knowledge? How you would have to massively reintroduce this agroecological knowledge, which was partly lost, as you mentioned, to these hundreds of thousands of peasant farmers with the support and so on. So it's a huge task. But if we're able to see that the crisis is coming, like with the climate change, then perhaps it's feasible to create the social movement and the pressure to begin to change the system. The problem might be that, of course, you have a strong opposition from landlords and so on, who would be all against this. Capitalist farmers, of course, who would be against it. And that therefore, when society begins to waking up to the problem, it might be too late, a bit in some ways similar to the climate change issue that, perhaps we're already in a tipping point where we can no longer create this agroecological farming that seems to be the rational way forward, assuming that all your arguments are correct. So it's a very general comment, but just a sort of intervention to how to bring this program that you have to make it more feasible and more realistic, to be able to begin this transition through various stages, of course, as it's a long-term program, but to map it out in some ways to show a route forward. That would be my comment. And again, great that you started to really work seriously on this issue, which we only mentioned in a sideline in some ways of the last and seventh agrarian question. But there you are, you made the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks. Now, before I hand back to you, we have a question from the floor here.
Mine is a very quick one, probably.
Close to the mic.
Probably not a little bit off topic, but what I wanted to find out was what do you think, or how does this approach serve in emergency situations, for example? Because I believe that these prevailing approaches slip in at this point and actually influence subsequent strategies.
Thanks, and thanks for people from the floor. are forced to get up next to us to the mic to speak into that. So it's all a bit complicated, but thanks. Now I'll hand over to you now. I'll just say that I'm aware it's practically 7 o'clock. Now people will start to leave because people don't have time just ad libitum and ad infinitum. But we will continue, I think, till we have finished all the questions also in the chat. And
Sure.
that will also be available on YouTube afterwards.
Yeah.
But so, yes,
Jens
over
is going
you.
to exploit my labor.
Indeed, as much as possible.
So Hashem, your first comment, I think the way that you put it in the latter part of what you were saying, we're simply not aware of the true cost of industrial food is absolutely spot on, because it goes not just beyond, the environmental consequences, the intergenerational consequences, but one also has to think about, the impact of a very bad diet on health problems and the cost of the healthcare system, right now in North America, Western Europe, and Australia, New Zealand. So the true cost of industrial food is far, far higher than that we think of it. It's not just the price that you're paying for your frozen pizza, which is pumped full of soy and high fructose corn syrup. So that's a very good point. Steve, thanks for the comment. And I have to say, I've only really become introduced to your work, I think, in the last 4 months, and it really is excellent. So I really commend people to look at Steve's work, right? And I totally agree that small-scale machinery, is absolutely, very important for small-scale agriculture. Agroecologists themselves talk about, they've got no problem thinking about machinery. It's about the terms and conditions by which it's secured and used, which is important. And certainly, I very often have used examples from rural Vietnam where I've done some work and looking at the impact that small-scale machinery can have on farming systems is quite dramatic. I can always think of one example when I was crossing a provincial border, and in one province, the provincial government had subsidized the acquisition of small-scale machinery for rice farmers, and the other province they hadn't. And it was quite remarkable. You were driving and you saw all these machines, you got to the border, you crossed the border, there was none. Just like that. It was really quite visually remarkable. And then when you looked in the actual rice paddies, you could see the difference. So I certainly concur that machinery doesn't equal industrial agriculture, and that's very important to me. Well, Chris, thank you for your comment. I certainly concur that there's a need to change property relationships to land when we think about transforming the system. But I also think that there's ways of thinking about new ways of arranging cultivation. I think when you look at, for example, Bina Agarwal's work on group farming in India, and she's in the process of trying to find relevant, she's found examples from Romania, from France, from Switzerland, of similar efforts at group farming in other parts of the world, that there are different ways of thinking about how land is cultivated. But group farms require access to land, of course, and so there has to be a change in property relations to land, particularly now, because one of the things that's really remarkable, I think, about the period since the food price crisis that started in 2007 is the extent to which, political economists who work on agriculture have been aware of the financialization of food and agriculture. And really, one of the areas where this is incredibly apparent is the financialization of land. Now, the financialization of land is something that we see in the advanced capitalist countries, such as in Canada, whereas increasingly, farmers are renting land from financial corporations. They're even sharecropping land from financial corporations. But I've been involved in a research project over the last few years looking at the pathways that young people have and the constraints on those pathways that young people have into farming. And one of the things that's come out of that is that the financialization of land is also something that was witnessed, for example, in Indonesia, on Java. So financialization is a much wider phenomenon. than we would generally think. And it's really important to get to grips with that. Economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States a few years ago did some research on rates of return, and they called the paper the rate of return on everything, and it goes from 1880 through till about 2015. The highest rate of return is on land over that very long-term period. So it really is quite interesting. In terms of transforming the food system, there's one thing that I think is really important to bring out that I haven't brought out in my talk and very often don't. And that is when we think about the how, I think it's really important to think about the jurisdiction in which you wish to affect change. And more particularly, you start at the most local level that you possibly can, where there are effective fiscal authorities. Yeah? Because if you can start to effect local decision-making through changes in fiscal arrangements, these can have knock-on effects. So the example that I use in this is from Canada. Canada is a federated state made up of a number of provinces which have significant authority over raising revenue and spending revenue. Ontario is the biggest. It has a population of about 9 million people. There's one jurisdiction, which is a full province, Prince Edward Island. Its population is less than 200,000. In that particular province, if you want to affect change, you go and talk to your neighbor because it's so small, yeah? And the provincial government responds to much more grounded, rooted, neighborly concerns. So if you want to bring in a support for potato farming, for example, for small scale organic potato farming, that provincial government is in a position to do it, and it's in a position to be pressured to do it from civil society. I think if we think about the jurisdiction that we're operating in where we're trying to strive for change, this is really important. You don't start at the national, you start at the local, but the local has to have some kind of fiscal capacity. And if they have that effective fiscal capacity, this is the area which can be subject to pressure from social movements. And I think that's really important in terms of changing the system. The final comment on complex emergencies, it certainly is true that when humanitarian organizations go into complex emergencies and then try and reconstruct rural livelihoods, especially the international organizations, their way of reconstructing rural livelihoods is to think about more industrial agricultural methods. And so there's a need to think about the way in which food systems can be resuscitated in a short period of time in complex emergencies that don't necessarily rely upon that. But I must confess, I've never thought about it. That was the first time when you raised it, I'd ever thought about it. So thank you for raising it, and I will think about it, because that is a hugely important question, especially in zones of conflict or zones of natural disaster.
Thanks. And I think the last round of questions will be the ones from the chat. Shreya, would you mind reading them out?
Yeah, no, not at all. Thanks, Jens. So I'll very quickly read a couple of questions from Andrea, who's asking, firstly, shouldn't we consider nutritional quality as important as agricultural production yields? So why aren't we talking about that? The second one is, second question she has is, it is hard to criticize agricultural capitalism without thinking about commercial circuits, especially if we want to pay attention to maintaining or lowering even food prices.
Sorry, Shreya, could you repeat that? I didn't quite get that.
Yeah, it says it is hard.
Oh, sorry, I see it in the chat.
Yeah, it's about commercial circuits, basically.
Yeah, I got it. Okay.
And then there's a question from David, who has asked, how can we bring in the role of the landless more into this agroecological question? And do we need to be back to land movements? What is the role of cooperatives? And finally, there's a question from Jose, which is, well, I slightly disagree with the argument that peasants always adopt more industrial agricultural practices if they can. there is some evidence that in favorable contexts, owing to education or markets, they can move towards sustainable trajectories, sometimes even agroecological. So what should be the most important contextual factors for promoting agroecological transitions? And I think that's everything.
Thanks, Ray. You dropped Helena's question.
Decommodifying
food.
Enrique had asked that.
Okay.
It was basically, I think, and Helena had asked about the urban poor and where do they.
But there's a new one here, which is
which I can't see. Maybe you
decommodifying food sounds great. Oh, it's to me only, it turns out. That's why you can't see it.
Higher prices
but you have also argued that higher prices as incentive for small farmers to adopt agroecology. Higher prices, decommodification, you can't have it both ways.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Right. Andrea, nutritional quality, absolutely incredibly important. Here's what I say, is that the science that I know on this indicates that there have been trend declines in cultivars in terms of the nutritional quality over the course of the Green Revolution. And this, in fact, is something which is very inadequately recognized outside those people that work upon it. And so, yes, there is a move, there should be moves to improve nutritional quality, but I do think agroecological farming methods, by getting away from commodified seeds bought from the agrochemical companies, is a way of rethinking about nutrition and prioritizing it, particularly as we move towards resuscitating seed saving as a way of thinking about moving forward. Your second question on commercial circuits is absolutely centrally important. The role of merchants' capital in structuring the way in which the terms and conditions of small-scale petty commodity producers are able to sell their products is absolutely vital, and that leads into then how those products are aggregated into by traders into larger bulk sales. Certainly in some parts of the world, it's the local merchant who is the principal face for small-scale farmers of, if you like, the enemy, because they're the face of capital that many small-scale petty commodity producers face. I don't have the time to go into the details on this, but alternatives, there are a number of countries where there are alternatives to private capital. In some parts of the world, you still sell to state traders, and although state trading companies do have a long history of inefficiency and exploitation of farmers, there are quite effective state trading companies that can be pointed to as well. So commercial circuits can work in the interests of farmers if restructured. David, yes, the role of the landless is absolutely central. As I mentioned, as I supported Chris in his comment, that there's a need to change the property relationship to land. That is something which would benefit some landless. I'm not necessarily going to say all landless, because it's unclear to me whether a restructured set of social property relations around land could create small-scale farms that will provide a livelihood for everyone that necessarily wants one. But what I do think is that thinking about alternative ways of cultivating, such as group cultivation, does provide new and fresh ways of thinking about how landless farmers that want to farm could be provided opportunities to farm. Juan, I agree with you. Although petty commodity producers in many settings do adopt fertilizers and pesticides if given the opportunity. As I said when I was responding to an earlier comment, when I look at farmers, particularly in Malawi, even when they accumulate a little bit, they don't want to opt for fertilizers because of climate change. They want to deepen their knowledge of agroecological processes. And so peasants, small-scale farmers, when they are exposed to the potential benefits that agroecological approaches have for them, they are very willing to consider them once they get over the risk factor, that inherent risk factor. Final point was from Helena, higher prices and decommodification. Is that a contradiction? No, not a contradiction at all. I'm saying, farmers should receive more for their product. Yeah. We should expect to pay more for what we're buying. That is not inconsistent with some elements of a basic nutritional basket being decommodified. Yeah. So we would get something as access to some items as a right of citizenship, and other things we would select. I don't see a contradiction there at all.
Very good, Haroon. Thanks so much. We have reached the end of this.
Oh, come on, let's go on for 2 more hours.
We will, but that is in a different setting.
Yeah.
But thanks so much. It was a pleasure. And of course, as the comments suggest, very illuminating.
And thanks
thanks to the audience online.
An in-person seminar.
Yeah, fantastic, isn't it?
Fantastic.
Now, we will have, our next seminar will be a webinar only. It's 3 weeks from now, 24th of February, where Tony Weiss, also from Canada, there's a pattern here, will talk on cheap meat and incalculably cost. Sorry, pardon the interpretation there, but the pronunciation there. But that is Tony Weiss in 3 weeks from now. But until then, goodbye to everyone. Thanks for attending, and of course, very much thanks to you.